President Biden's Build Back Better taxation and spending agendas, along with congressional Democrats' own proposals, seem to be approaching a resolution. What effect may these have on you, on the economy, on the markets, on your grandkids, and on the American experiment? Stay tuned as the RLS boys debate the practical and philosophical impacts of these mammoth proposals right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. I am your co-host, Roshan Loungani, here as always with Adrian Nicholson and Erik Olson. We are really excited about today's episode. We are going to break down the Biden plan, the tax plan that they're working on right now in Congress. They're debating and trying to get through. And as we were preparing for this, we always have a quick chat before we record it. We start the recording, and we wish we had started it already because we had a spirited debate to begin with. Erik, why don't you start us off with your thoughts on why this is an important topic to review?
All right. Well, tax policy in general for our clients makes sense at a very pragmatic level because to the extent that we're planners and they're looking to us for guidance, then on that basis, we'd like to have at least some sense of where the winds might be blowing from a standpoint of tax policy and so forth. And so on that level, whether it's estate planning related, whether it's tax related, whether it's business related, whatever impacts there are on that side that might be affecting our clients, then generally speaking, we want to be apprised of that and apprise you, our listeners, of that. So whether or not you're a client that you can benefit from it. But I also think that another thing that we all share, both we, the hosts and our listeners, is that we're Americans. And so these are weighty questions right now. The scope and size of the proposals that are on the table are of a magnitude and are coming at it with a timing that I think no one would deny these are small potatoes debates right now. So I think it's useful at times to step back and say, as Americans, is this what we really want? Is this going to help us as Americans obtain the kind of society that we want? And so as co-hosts, we just thought for you, our listeners, this would be a timely moment to have this conversation as we approach what may be the conclusion of what has been, I don't know, fellas, feels like it's been about an 18-month conversation with various manifestations and permutations, but it feels like maybe here before December 3rd, we will get this done, and maybe even before the end of October.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, it really is interesting, Erik. And just preparing for this podcast, it's just, like you said, just so many new changes and updates where it's covering all areas, whether it's businesses, contributions, tax changes, it's just a lot. And the numbers are just incredibly high. There are also just so many out there where you just really have to really look into this and see how also this can personally impact you in your situation and see what areas that you can do or need to make changes. I think is just really important. And just the broad economic impact too is also just something that we as investors are really looking at, what areas and sectors and industries are going to be really impacted by these changes if they go through, is also just really important. And that's why we thought it would just be good just to have this discussion today, just to see how many areas and how many individuals and businesses and entities it really impacts.
Erik, what you mentioned earlier, going beyond just the tax issue of you mentioned the philosophical issue of where do we want to go? I mean, isn't that where the division just begins right now in the country? I feel like almost on every major issue, you've got people who just so strongly disagree, and some are definitely fact-based arguments, but some are that what seems to be from someone who doesn't have enough social media experience to say it's a fact, because I don't check this stuff very much, I've read a lot about how it seems to be the creation of this echo chamber that supports your thoughts and ideas versus the open-mindedness to hear both sides. And that's what the Facebook whistleblower that we've saw a lot recently talked about. And I don't know if that's the case, but that the philosophical part we could spend hours and hours recording about.
Well,
I think.
First of all, I fully agree with that. I love philosophy, and I love the conversations about the consequences at not merely a financial level or a tax level or an economic level, but I also really think the conversations about what takes place in terms of the social fabric, what takes place with the development of character and of productive, the next generation being productive and their outlooks and so forth. I'm maybe that's as I get older and I have grandchildren, I'm more my concerns, I suppose, about the formation of outlooks and values among younger people has assumed a larger and larger focus for me. But I think the philosophical question. Actually, I think if you'd like to get into the philosophical questions, I'm happy to.
I don't think we
do that.
can.
You don't think we can?
I think we've already gone over 5 minutes of it, and when we start for those of you listening, before we hit record, we said there's so much information we should dive right in. 5 minutes later, we haven't started. So Erik, I'm going to bring us back a little bit, and Adrian, actually, I'm going to ask you, starting with the potential tax law changes. Tell me what stood out to you. What's the first item that's sort of top of mind after getting prepared for this?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I kind of saw is just basically how much money can the Democrats really just like pull in with all this? What's going to go through? What's not going to go through? And like it's going to cause like a lot of like debates and discussions, like you said, not only in like DC, but like online as well. Like I spend like sometimes too much time looking at it. And I think it contributes to some of like my gray hairs at being 25 years old. So I don't really appreciate that. But so just overall, just seeing where we talked about this in the podcast, seeing how much money they can really raise and then the areas it's going to go into. One of the biggest things is like infrastructure. That's a big thing. That's going to be like trillions of dollars. That's a big area that they want to funnel money to, repairing like roads, building better healthcare centers, and just seeing how that really impacts the overall economy is a big area. So I think that's like a really good place to like kind of start and touch on and talk about. It's really important. And also another element that goes into all this is increasing not only taxes on an individual level, but on a corporate level as well, which it's a big conversation. I think is a good starting point, but there's, like you said, just so many areas, but I think that's like one of the ones that I've been looking into the most that I think is really interesting, and where it ends up is even more.
So Adrian, there was a lot there. I'm trying to summarize, and don't let me misquote you, so to speak, but you're saying, you're talking about spending, right? Not about the taxation at this point. So is the connection you're making that if we're going to be spending this much money, we've got to raise money in taxes?
It's kind of, I kind of see it as one and the same, but also that's like the big thing with the deficit and the debt ceiling and that increasing, which is going to impact certain areas like inflation or interest rates. And that's also like another big area that people are looking into, because if you're somebody that's retired and you live on a fixed income, this is like a very important area that you would focus on. So it's seeing all these like changes and seeing all these like proposals and seeing how it affects different individuals, I think is just like really interesting. And I think that's where if you're a listener, this is why we're having this discussion today, just bringing up all these different topics and proposals and just seeing how this could affect your overall plan.
So can I respond, Roshan, to your question, or did you have
Please.
something you wanted to add right now?
I was going to totally change directions on us, so I'll let you respond before I
I feel
do
like
that.
it's going to be a lot of changing directions today.
Yeah, well,
and
no, I mean, I think
heated
that
debates, and I'm going to have an additional gray hair after all this, but it's okay.
So, listeners, you have to understand that sometimes the what we bite off for these episodes seems maybe a little bit too much, and I think this is an instance today where this is probably true. So we struggle at times to wonder how do we, in a way that's easily apprehended by you, our listener, how do we organize this conversation in a way that's systematic and interesting to you? So I think already we've identified several categories. So one is the spending stuff. I have a few things to say about the spending. We've talked about taxes. I have a few things to say about the taxes. So and I guess I would just make some analogies from all of that. So first of all, with the principle that you, I think, were saying, Adrian, and which you, I think, were trying to ask Roshan if Adrian was expressing, I'm going to say wholeheartedly a yes to this. While I am not a big fan of big government, in fact, here's a philosophical principle that I'll throw in just for good measure right now. I think the bigger the government, the smaller the citizen. The bigger the government, the smaller the citizen. And I want big citizens. So hence I want small government. But if we are going to spend gazillions of dollars, that's not a technical term, but if we're going to spend gazillions of dollars, then I think we should pay for that ourselves in our generation and not transfer that cost off to other people. So while I'm pro low taxes because I'm pro growth, and I'm pro growth because I'm pro poverty alleviation, and nothing alleviates poverty like growth, and nothing promotes growth like not competing for the capital formation of the wealth creation process. Then hence I like small government, low taxes, high growth, and add through that social development and poverty alleviation. That's the chain of causation in my view. But I do think we should pay for it if we're going to spend it now, rather than just loading it into this ever-increasing national debt that we ask our grandchildren to absorb.
Well, and this is where I was going to shift direction, right? Because I think we can go down the path of, can we spend money? Not can we, should we spend money? We obviously can. But if we go down the path of should we spend, instead of going down that path, money's been spent, right, through the pandemic. And let's shift the perspective. I know this is not the case, but let's imagine that a lot of these adjustments they're making are for money that's spent, just so we don't have the debate of should we be spending more money. And let's get into some of these proposals that they're talking about. And some of the adjustments. So, Erik, I'm going to ask you,
Sure.
Is there any specific proposal or adjustment that this tax plan has that you say, I like this and I fully support this, or is there the one that you're the most strongly against? What stands out to you first?
Well,
and for everyone else listening, I already know that Erik is against almost all of it, which is why I posed a question like that.
Yes, I'll say this one. There's one spending proposal that I've seen that I would say I do support, and that's for improved funding for historically black colleges and universities. So I think that is what that does is that provides more opportunity for people to get a great education who have been had a maybe more challenging time doing that, and as a result have a better shot at entering the mainstream productively. So I'm for that.
Okay, so let's say you're for that. That's a new spending. Which of these items in this bill are you for to pay for that? How are you going to pay for it, assuming you can't come up with something that's not already proposed?
So what I would say is what I would be in favor of is expanding if we do this, I would be raising the income tax on all income tax tiers, rather than saying this has to be paid by the 1%, the 2%, or the 5%. Let me just mention why. Many times in this country, we hear this phrase: "The rich have to pay their fair share." That's the frequently uttered rationale for why we should have this or that tax policy. So I just want to ask the listener to consider, what would you define as paying a fair share. And now this is going to sound as if I'm somehow defending the 1%, the 5%.
I am changing directions on you real quick, Eric.
Okay.
So I want to go back to your proposal, and for everyone listening, I don't believe we've run the numbers, but Analytical Eric may have. I'm trying to give you an out. You haven't run the numbers to see if this adds up. You're adding this policy for HBCUs. You're trying to pay for it through income taxes. So your numbers may or may not add up.
Correct.
But what you're proposing is, right now, the proposal is one, increasing the top marginal tax bracket to 39.6, but also lowering where that starts. Right now, just picking on married couples, the top marginal bracket starts at $628,000, and they're going to lower that to $450 for married couples. So you're saying, instead of doing that, and let's forget the income levels that brackets change.
Sure.
But in general, raise it for everybody, is your point.
That's my point. Then the reason is, so many times people are saying, they make actually two arguments. Number one, they make the argument about paying their fair share. And then they also make references to, hey, why don't we have a system that's like Denmark or something like that? What they don't often say is that two things in response to that. What is the 1% paying their fair share? By the way, I'm not in the 1%. But if I were, I wouldn't. If I were, I'm not. That doesn't matter. What would define the 1%? Would it be the 1% paying 1% of all the taxes? I think most people would say, no, that's not what we mean by that. Okay, so how much what share of income does the 1%? It's astonishingly high. It's a 20% of the national income in 2018 was personal income. I mean to say, was in the hands of the top 1%. So would fair share be then that they pay 20% of the income taxes? Well, the fact is in 2018 they paid. Do you guys want to take a guess at this one? I mean, listeners, you guess what number is about to come out of my mouth. Was it 20%? Was it 25? Was it 26? 30? What was it? It was 40% of the income taxes paid were paid by the group of people that had 20% of the income. Wouldn't that imply they're paying twice their fair share?
Hold on, Eric. So here's the thing. The argument, I think, on the other side, here's a quote that makes sense. They're lies, damn lies, and statistics. Yeah. Right?
Sure.
So one side that says exactly what you said, they're paying 40% of the overall taxes. Yes, they're being overtaxed. And the counter side is they're paying on an average based on their wealth a less percentage than other people are paying at a lower income.
If we're using wealth, you introduced wealth in that conversation, and so there's no denying that they have wealth. But what I just said was income taxes.
I'm not saying what they have. Hold on. You're going in a different direction.
Are we talking about income or wealth?
Let's go with income, right?
Yeah, okay.
They're saying as a percentage of their income, are they paying less?
No.
Yes, they're paying the majority of overall. You're going marginal tax bracket?
I'm saying whether it's the average tax rate or it's the share of the tax burden on an national income tax basis, they have twice the share relative to their income.
So what's the Warren Buffett thing saying he pays less in taxes than his secretary? Percentage. He's talking about percentage.
Because most of Warren Buffett's compensation is not on
capital
salary.
Gains.
So it's not
capital gains.
Right, it's on capital gains.
Right. So isn't that, and I for everyone listening, I am not necessarily on the other side of the debate. This debate, I am pro fair comparison, and I think Eric was giving a skewed comparison. Eric, no offense. That's okay. That's why I say, just because, and I'm picking Warren Buffett because I don't have the numbers. Right. I didn't look up this comparison, but isn't the argument on the other side just the Warren Buffett argument? Now you're saying yes, it's capital gains versus income. Whatever it is Warren Buffett paying less in average taxes than his secretary?
If you were including his tax on his income and on his investment income, earned income and investment income, it very well is the case that he is paying a lower average rate on the total than his secretary is paying on her total income, insofar as she may have more. She's probably pretty highly compensated being a secretary at Berkshire Hathaway, and may not have the same amount of investment income in the form of dividend income, qualified dividend income or long-term capital gain income, realized, I should say, that Warren Buffett has. There's no question about that. But you're using the outlier to make the point, and I don't think that that's necessarily a basis on which to make tax policy.
You're talking about 1%ers. Isn't that by definition an outlier?
Well, I would say in terms of a 0.001% is where you took the argument, as opposed to a 1%. So, I mean, we're talking about, you're talking about one in 10 million, something like that, 1 in 100 million, something like that, and I'm talking about 1 in 100. So,
it's the only only easy answer I had, quite frankly, because Buffett said it so much off the top of my head.
Right.
But once again, I'm not trying to say you're right or you're wrong. I'm trying to say there are two sides to this debate.
Certainly.
And if you go with gross taxes paid, no question, there's more gross taxes paid by that group than the average. But then if you go by percentage of your wealth, and let me take out wealth because I know you're going to jump on that, but percentage of wealth and income paid versus others, it's a lower percent. Right, and I'm by no means arguing that there should be higher taxes for any group or lower taxes for any group. I'm just saying that there are both sides. Both sides pick stats that support their argument, and I'm just trying to put the other side out there. I'm going to move us on, and I'm sorry I'm not letting you respond because I want to touch on something else on the tax bill.
Yes.
And Adrian, I'll ask you. Is there anything that stands out that they're going to raise taxes on that you specifically, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say raise. Any change in the tax plan that you specifically like or don't like that stands out? Erik had one, which was if you're going to raise taxes, raise it on everybody versus on just one group. Does anything stand out like that for you?
Yeah, and then I'll address another thing, not kind of like backtracking us, but I brought up before the corporate tax again. I think that's the most interesting area. I believe it was originally going to be raised to 28, but now they're talking about 25%. And I think that's definitely an area that's interesting because it's going to impact different industries and different sectors differently. And just the overall taxation on corporations in general, corporations that line item their profits out overseas or something, they're going to be cracking that down on more. They're going to be looking at corporations like book income and profits as well to see if they can tax that more. I think those are all areas that are going to be extremely interesting to watch to see how that really impacts short term the markets and then the long term aspects of it as well.
Okay, and I should have said this at the beginning. So for all our listeners, halfway through the episode, I'm giving you information that you should have known at the top. Erik, when you do the intro, please include this. When we split up the assignments at the beginning, Adrian was going to go try to come up with things he was for the plan. Erik was going to go with things where he's against the proposal. My job was sort of to moderate, but I talk too much, so that went left, right? But so Adrian, I want to ask you on this corporate tax rate. I think this is we could spend the rest of the time talking about this. Are you saying you think this is a good move or a bad move, or you just want to observe and see what happens?
I mean, it'll definitely be good and bad. It really just boils down to the industries, and I think in the different businesses, I think that's really important, and it makes you kind of want to look at your overall portfolio and see what areas you're really concentrated in that could really be impacted if this change went through. I think that's also another thing to make note of.
All right. So, Erik, your thoughts on this corporate tax rate going up?
Well, I look at tax rate as a competition among countries. And so people set rates, and if you want to attract capital and you want to attract businesses, then you ought to have a tax rate that those businesses that are determining where they want to domicile, especially the big ones, that's what we're talking about, the big businesses. You want to have a tax rate that's compelling to them. And so the higher you make it, especially when you throw on the fact that in many countries they have just a national income tax on those corporations rather than a national and state income tax on those corporations. And so it's really here when we say it's was 35 or it would reduce to 21. Let's raise it to 28. Maybe we can compromise at 25. All of those are just the federal part. And if you then throw on a state level, now you've thrown these companies back into a situation where they say, okay, now we're looking at rates that really are pressing back up into the highest echelons of all of the tax rates available within the OECD countries. So I'm saying if we want wealth creation. That helps people of all income tiers. So don't raise corporate taxes. But I also have, we talked about, Roshan, some spending stuff. So I've got a load of spending commentary on, and was just listing without getting into a debate about it, just identifying where we kind of stand right now with some of the spending proposals. So let's make room for that.
I want to summarize what you just described on the taxes.
Sure.
and just give it a really easy example, especially after the pandemic when people can pretty much work from wherever they want. If rates are up and we're already at 21 going up to 25, I think Erik is saying, I'm giving an extreme example, but why not move your corporation to Barbados where you pay 5.5%, right? Especially when you can be anywhere versus staying here. And Erik, I love the extreme examples when I threw Buffett at you as well, but does that essentially summarize what you're saying? Why would you domicile here if you could pay less taxes anywhere else?
In most other places, that's exactly right.
But I was also looking, aren't they doing
Let's...
something like, I think Biden's talking about doing something nationally where you can't do that, where they're trying to make it fair like across globally, but I'll have to look into that. But I heard they're trying to create some like national average for corporations as well.
Well, what they're trying to do, Adrian, is to establish through a treaty without actually having it ratified by the Senate, a global minimum corporate tax.
Yeah, global intangible low tax, I believe, GILTI is what they're calling it.
Yeah. And so on this, then, if everybody plays ball, it's let's essentially agree to squeeze all of these corporations and not give them a place where they can escape the high tax rates that we all would like to impose on them. That's the thought.
Well, don't you, I see. My thought on this is you're taxing the people that have money to pay people to figure out ways around it.
Right, exactly. The big corporations do have that.
So
yes.
I feel like, it's a good thought, but somebody's going to figure out a way around it. That person will become very wealthy when they advise all these corporations on how to save tax money. But Erik, let's go on to your spending.
Okay, and then I would like to come back and we can have some time to talk about specific tax proposals without necessarily commenting in depth on the pros or cons. But on the spending side, as you know, as our listeners may have been tracking, this was once upon a time supposed to be a $3.5 trillion. I can't even believe I'm starting a sentence or starting one of those, an illion with a T. It's just crazy to me. But anyway, $3.5 trillion bill. And because of a lot of difficulty getting West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin and Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema to play ball with what the other 48 senators want, Democratic senators at least want, as well as what the House, dominated at this point, it's still controlled by the Democratic Party, and what the White House wants, there's had to be some negotiation and some scaling back. And so now what I'm hearing in the most recent days is that could be scaled all the way back to maybe a $1.9 trillion spending proposal. And so some things are in and some things are out. So what I'm seeing is probably staying in is expanding Medicare to include dental, vision, and hearing coverages. Probably what stays also is some degree of universal pre-kindergarten education. Also, several billions of dollars would be spent on some aspects of climate change. Some would be spent on expanding child care tax credit or child tax credits that would be refundable tax credits. The difference, if you're listening and you're thinking, what do we mean by refundable? That means even if you didn't pay any tax, you can still list the child on there and get a tax refund of tax you didn't pay in the first place. So it can be essentially a transfer payment to that household. more money to make housing more affordable, and that's the fine print is always the question there. More money for paid leave. It had been discussed as maybe 12 weeks of paid leave. Now it looks like it might be 4 weeks of paid leave to take care of somebody who's ailing. More money on maternal health, which is always sort of a broad and slippery category for me. I'm not sure what that means exactly in this case. And then I also mentioned about the HBCUs. But what looks like might not hold up in this is free community college. So that's one of the things that it looks like is not gonna squeeze through in this case.
So, Erik, I'm learning you're looking at this spending. You said you'd share what they're spending money on. You said you'd share a list. First isn't it a little ridiculous that you're like, I thought it was crazy that it's $3 trillion, but it's only 1.9 now.
Isn't that, yes, I know.
Right.
Just I can't believe I said only. That's
You may not have, but that's the way I thought about it. You said, I can't believe I started a sentence like this, and then it's down to 1.9. All of a sudden, it sounds like a huge savings, right?
Right.
But any of these spending things that you mentioned the HBCUs earlier, anything that how you were for that, anything you particularly are against on that list, or what's the one that stands out the most that you'd be against on there?
Well, for reasons, it's a complex issue. I recognize it, but I'm not a big fan of universal pre-K. And the reason for that is I do think at the early years, presence with small children with their parents is a more valuable part of their overall formation as learners and as people. There's a lot of other things to learn besides reading and writing and arithmetic, prior to age 5 or 6. And so if you say, hey, well, we're gonna try to, what it seems to me honestly is, I just think it's losing sight of what's fundamentally important in the formation of small children, and it's substituting for that this notion of Head Start. First of all, I do believe our schools are not doing an adequate job of educating people, and so on that basis, the conversation about, hey, let's tack on some extra time in school before kindergarten, let's tack on free community college, maybe we'll get better educated people. I think, well, one solution to that might be just to improve the use of the 13 years that you already have them in your classrooms. So you've got them for 13 years before they're age 18. Would it be possible to intensify the experience of education in that phase rather than having be so much more, I will say, focused on the formation of their social outlooks, as opposed to truly learning how to function productively, to read and to reason and to write and to know history and to know science and so forth.
Well, isn't Head Start supposed to be better for the child? Like I did a Google search while you were explaining this, and the first thing that comes up is children show significantly better social, emotional, language, and cognitive development via Head Start. So my question to you is, I guess 2 points. One is respond to that. I don't have data. That's just what Google said at the very top. And second is when you talk about those 13 year, you're limited by the child's age right early as far as how much you can do. I have a 3-year-old, and he just started preschool 2 days a week, and they split at his age. If you're a younger 3, they go twice a week. If you're older 3, they go 3 times a week. And the reason the school said they do it that way is because the younger ones just can't handle that additional time, right? Like they're so. Any thoughts on? I don't have data for you. I know we're both kind of data heads here. But I just got some anecdotal information, but what are your response to those?
Well, so I've heard the data. So I don't, I'm a financial planner, not a Head Start specialist, but I've heard that the data are mixed. And so, but it's still possible.
Isn't everything though?
Well, so it's still possible for me to concede the point that there are some children who indeed do benefit from that experience. But it doesn't mean that by virtue of the fact that some children do benefit from that experience compared to what they might otherwise be getting at home, or more specifically, might not be getting at home. That doesn't mean that every household is denying their children some of that learning opportunity that they would otherwise now be consigned to receive through a pre-K, universal pre-K experience. I mean, let's just put it this way. One of the things has seemed, from what my limited familiarity with the literature on this subject is that one of the strongest predictors of how successful a child will be in school once they enter school is how many hours their parents were reading to them, or someone who had reading ability was reading to them prior to their entering school. Just sitting there and having their eyes follow along with the reader's finger and showing them the words and allowing them to get the connection between the printed language and a story or something along that kind. It engages the brain in a different way, and the more words they hear and the more reading that they receive, the better prepared they are for their education. So, to summarize, yes, there indeed, I can accept that there may be many children who've benefited from Head Start. That doesn't mean that every child needs Head Start.
Well, let's move on to this, and just for time, let's go through the taxes, since that's what we plan to talk about. So we mentioned the corporate tax rate.
Mm-hmm.
We've mentioned the potential change on the marginal rate, and just to touch on that very briefly again, because we mentioned that based on what your thoughts were. The proposal is not to raise it across every bracket, as Erik said. It would be what he thought would be better. The proposal is to raise it for the top bracket only, and to raise it that would be for married couples. It was $450. For individual single payers, it would be $400,000, and for head of household, $425,000, and it would bump them up to the 39.6 bracket. What else is on your list that you'd want to highlight of proposed changes?
Well, I've got a few. Adrian, I've done a lot of the talking. Is there a couple of these tax proposals that you want to comment about, or do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, I think an interesting one would be the stepped-up basis. I think that's going to be a really important one, and just monitoring that.
Just explain for people who aren't familiar with it. Adrian, what is the step-up in basis?
Yeah, I can go into that. Well, it's kind of like just inheriting, let's just say, a position or a stock where the original person, let's just say, they purchased it for $10,000, it grew to $100,000, and then they passed that particular stock on. Well, in this case, the proposed tax policy that they're implementing, saying that $90,000 in growth will now be a taxable event. So I think that's going to be something really interesting to follow. And I think that could, in a sense, kind of create some type of movements in the markets, depending on how people kind of like react to that, how investors would react to that. I think is going to be something that people need to make note of moving forward.
Yeah, agreed completely. Okay, I got another one. So,
hold on, before you go into the other ones, let's just touch on, assuming you weren't going down this route, just the other estate planning impacted ones. Were you going that way, Erik?
Well, yeah, I think that's big. Just like if you have a trust, kind of determine what kind of trust is it, because that article that you sent us before, Erik, it's like so many areas are going to be impacted. I think that's a really big thing that people should be taking into consideration.
Go ahead, Roshan.
Yeah, so just a couple highlights on it. The first would be lowering the current exemption, the unified gift and estate tax exemption, from 11.7 million down to 3.5. What stood out to me on this too is there's not going to be a cost of living adjustment on this, which to me was just, they're going to fix the numbers, and in theory, no cost of living adjustment means 100 years down the road, it's the same number, right? And not accounting for inflation. Adrian, you mentioned the change in the step up in basis. There's going to be a reduction on the annual gift tax. Right now, you can gift $15,000 to anybody. They're talking about lowering that to $10,000. And right now, a donor can give $15,000 to like 10 different people, and you're fine. They're going to lower that to $20,000 in total. There are a bunch of adjustments to trust. There's so many. I just don't want to go into individual detail on that. And Eric, let's go back now. What do you have?
Well,
next
let's just
on
throw
that?
one in there since you're on that estate topic. So if they lower the threshold on what's subject to the federal estate tax to 3.5 million,
Yep.
it's currently at 11, close to 12 million per person.
Yep.
We have a lot of households in our client base that will start to feel the pinch of that, and they may think, well, wait a second, I don't have 7 million right now. But you live another 30 years, you might.
Yeah.
And so,
And the reason Eric said
talking
7,
about-
hold on, I just want to explain that. The reason Eric
His and
said
hers.
7 is he's thinking of a couple. Yeah. So it's 3.5 per individual. But Eric, continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So it's per individual, so you have a his and hers, so that the household level it could be, if you're married filing jointly, whatever. It could be 7. But one of the other interesting ones that I think about this from the standpoint of, pardon me, the capital gains. Well, a lot of our listeners are investors, and some of them have their assets. Of course, many have many of their assets in tax deferred accounts. But for those that have them also in taxable accounts, or that have a piece of real estate that's a commercial piece of real estate, or something like that, currently the rate structure for capital gains can be 0, 15, 20, or if you're subject to what's known as the net investment income tax, then it could add another 3.8. So your top rate could be 23.8. The proposal would change that and have the top rate move to 25, still keeping that 3.8 NIIT tax in place, bringing it to 28.8, and for those that are even higher bracket still, it could add another 3% surcharge on top of that. So now you're looking at a rate that could be pretty far up there. Also another proposal that could affect real estate investors is treating some you want to say something about that?
Well, I just wanted to say, don't forget that doesn't include state tax. That's just federal.
And you're right. Layer the state tax on top of that. And if the state tax makes no distinction between capital gains and ordinary income, let's say in a state like Illinois where it's 5%, then you throw on another 5% log on that fire. But I think what's also interesting is that some real estate investors who have assumed, we'll have business income that'll be at a 30 real estate income, not from the sale proceeds, but from just managing real estate and commercial real estate, and it flows from that. If you're taxed at 37%, but you've been enjoying what's known as a qualified business deduction of 20%, the effective rate on that is, if I'm doing the math here fast enough, it's like 29.6, right about there. But if you instead say, no, now we're going to raise it to 39.6, we're going to throw on this 3.8% surcharge, and again, that other 3% surcharge. Now you're talking about a 47% something, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's a giant, 46 and change maybe it is, but somewhere between less than 30 to now the mid to high 40s on that. Also, what will that do to real estate? What will that do to real estate investors? How will they think about wanting to go buy another property to, offer more housing, or construct another property to offer more rental housing? I think, it's the unintended consequences, or the second order consequences of a lot of these things. You can't stop at, well, what does it do to revenues? No, you have to look at what does it do to revenues, but also what does it do to people who are self-interested actors in that sector, and what do you in fact make housing more expensive because you make the supply more constrained.
Yeah, that the unintended consequences one I find most interesting with this proposed unrealized capital gains tax on billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To me, that is crazy.
We need to
that's
explain
the one
that
stood out to me as the craziest one.
Yeah, explain that one.
If you're a billionaire and you are invested in your company stock essentially, and that's what made you a billionaire, and you haven't sold the stock yet, they're going to tax you on that gain even though you haven't realized it. So typically, in order to pay tax, because the value of that, using stock as an example, that value of that stock literally moves every single day, right? So your gain is changed on a daily basis, and it could turn into a loss no matter how much the gain has become. So the fact that you could get taxed on an unrealized move on something, to me, it just seems I can't even believe that's in there. It's like, who thought of that one?
Right. Now, most billionaires don't have their billions, like Warren Buffett does, in liquid securities. Most billionaires have their assets in illiquid securities. So some listeners may be saying, Erik, do you have any billionaire listeners? Why are we having this conversation? And the reason why I think this is important, I think Roshan and Adrian, you'd agree, is that it's not merely what that signifies as a fundamental shift in the historic American attitude toward the taxation of wealth as opposed to income, but it's also, which that disturbs me. But I would say what more disturbs me and concerns me in terms of its actual ramifications is that once you establish in this country that it is okay to tax wealth, then it creeps out from the billionaire class and it proceeds down. People may say, pshaw, Erik, come on, really? Well, just do a little bit of research yourself on how originally the income tax was built. It was marketed as, oh, don't worry, this is only going to apply to a very, very tiny sliver of the wealthiest Americans, and we're only going to take 1 or 2% of their income. Come on, don't get all riled up. Once the principle was established, then it spread from there, and it was in very short order after that, this creation in the early 20th century, that by the 50s, you had marginal rates that were at 90% for some earners. And in fact, it was a major campaign issue for a young Senator, John Kennedy, that he was going to campaign for lower marginal income tax rates. It's said differently, in only a generation it had gone from, oh, this won't affect anybody, to it was something that a young man was elected president on, in part because he saw the ridiculousness and the economic harm that this was doing. So I just don't want to see that principle entrenched, that you can tax wealth, let alone unrealized capital gain.
Yeah, that's a big point that you brought up, Erik, and it is just like a lot of money when you think about it in perspective, but also like taking kind of like the opposite end of it. I think kind of like the main thing that the Democrats are trying to really address, and why they're kind of, making these kind of proposals for unrealized capital gains, moving up the top individual bracket, adding this surtax into it, is to just address like the wealth gap, which has kind of increased because like the pandemic and all these other things that are going on, where the wealth gap, I think it's like 1% owns like a good majority of the wealth, where their assets and their funds are mostly held up in like the stock market or real estate, all of which have done really well and outpace inflation. So this causes a big kind of concentration in wealth, where we could say it's being concentrated kind of by the 1%. And just an effective way to kind of address this wealth gap, it just, like in simple terms, would just be to tax this group. I think that's kind of like one of the areas, or like the opposite ends of this debate, is to kind of look at, where's all this money being concentrated, especially after a pandemic, and what would be the most like effective way for, let's just say, to benefit the majority. And I know this is kind of more of a philosophical like kind of debate and question to go into, but that's kind of like the thing that they're looking at, just addressing this wealth gap that seems to just be increasing because of where the assets are concentrated.
Well, hold on. I want to address two things with that. Right. First is with that billionaire tax on unrealized capital gains for addressing the wealth gap, or really whatever you're going to use it for. Um, you mentioned, Eric, unintended consequences before, and even when you were talking about this unrealized gains, you talked about illiquid assets. What gets me with this whole thing overall is, just think it through for a second. Let's say I have an illiquid asset, and that's where my wealth is primarily in illiquid assets. I need to go either sell an asset or get a loan against it to pay a tax on something. So they're taxing money that I don't have, right? So that's the first thing. And then, Adrian, you mentioned with the wealth gap and the appreciation of assets along the way, due to the pandemic, things have gone up. Government spending has come in to help support the pandemic. That has also caused markets to go up, which has increased wealth. What's the alternative? Let the country starve during the pandemic just so you don't let certain people that you think have too much wealth get more? The intent of all the stimulus was to stabilize the economy and help the country. An unintended consequence was this increase in wealth. I'm not pro wealth gap. I'm just, I guess, pro taking responsibility for what. And when I say taking the responsibility, if you were for all this spending, you created part of this wealth gap, and you're going to fix it by taxing the people who benefited from that when that wasn't your intent. It just, that whole thing, that once again, it comes off very cold and like I'm pro the wealth gap. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is, are you really trying to fix it this way?
So I'm going to maybe surprise our progressive listeners. And by the way, listeners, if you're thinking, first of all, I very much appreciate if you're a progressive and you are continuing to listen all the way this deep into this episode. I admire you for your suffering through the inanity of all the things that I've said, at least from your vantage point. But I will agree that I am troubled by the impact of policy on having created these asset bubbles. I'm troubled for two reasons. I am troubled for, as you've already pointed out, Adrian, the inequality effect of that. I'm very troubled by that. I'm also troubled by it because I think what it does is, if what goes up sometimes will come down. And so if you create asset bubbles broadly through artificial means, then what that does is it creates, I think, it distorts people's allocations of capital. And also what it does is it creates deep disruptions that sometimes are even harder to recover from. I would say, though, that while stimulus has played an effect, even more, at least looking back all the way to late 2008 and early 2009, even more has been Fed policy. And by squeezing interest rates such that people feel like there's no opportunity to own bonds, and hence they redirect their capital toward risk assets, what that has created in many risk assets is, I would say, this bubble effect. So bubble's too strong. In certainly a level of asset pricing that would not have existed had the Fed not taken such a long and aggressive approach to quantitative easing. So I'm with you there, Adrian, on the inequality element of it, for sure.
Yeah. As I said earlier, that's a problem, right? You look at, and I was thinking back to, remember reading in 08 or 09 that that's one of the things that showed the beginning of a fall of a society, right? You get this major wealth gap. So it's definitely a problem. When I was saying policies created this, I was thinking both fiscal and monetary.
Okay, yeah,
right.
All right. Mm-hmm.
It's definitely been created that way. I just don't think they're going to fix it with taxation.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting. So I am, as I've said already several times in this, thinking that the best. Let me just back up. So, especially our progressive listeners, I'll just say, believe it or not, once upon a time, I would have been considered a socialist. And so I what shifted my thinking was my wife and I moved to China, and we were there for 2 years, and we were listening to the stories of the people that with whom we interacted, and we understood more of what had led to chaos and impoverishment and starvation. And then the policy changes there that led to explosive numbers, millions and tens of millions emerging out, and hundreds of millions emerging out of poverty. And then when I, after that, came back to grad school and then started studying economic development in less developed countries, and saw over and over and over this pattern was the same, that creating opportunity for wealth creation was what alleviated poverty. It produced a major shift in my thinking. I felt like I couldn't adhere to the old ideology any longer, and I had to recognize that wealth creation was what was delivering people from this. So my prescription then for our own country would be that we give unfettered less fettered opportunity for people to use an opportunity society to create wealth. And so that's a conversation for another day about how that might happen.
Well, the only question I have for that, Erik, is I like that idea, but can't that like kind of lead? Again, this is more like a philosophical and more morals, but like, can't that lead to people to take kind of advantage of that like system as well? To you'd hope that there are some people who like use it to create like opportunity, hear about those success stories. That's good. But then with these like policies and these changes, there's also leaves room for people to just take advantage of that to kind of just create even more of a wealth gap. If you kind of understand what I'm saying with that. But again, that's more of a...
Yes. So let me respond to that in this way. In the same way I responded to some of my fellow graduate students who weren't making that same shift that was occurring in my own thinking. I asked these fellow students, who I might once have said were fellow socialists, but I was no longer. I was shifting. What was more important to you? What would you be more gratified with the outcome of A or B, where A is the wealth gap shrinks, but the poor are made worse off, and what really is shrinking the wealth gap is harm done to the rich? Or would you prefer if the wealth gap increased, but as within that process of the wealth gap, why can't I not say this? Wealth gap increasing, the poor also had a substantially improving physical quality of life. And guess which they chose? A.
By what you said, they chose A.
Right. And my attitude was, then you don't really care so much about the poor as much as your rhetoric suggests you do. Because if you cared about the poor, you would focus on the impact on poor people and be less concerned with income inequality. Sometimes the process of that capital formation does increase inequality, but the main question is what is it actually doing to the ability of poorer people to live a better and better life? And that's what I'm focused on.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Erik.
And for me, it's I think more simple in that if you created the problem, why would I give you more money thinking you'll fix it?
Okay.
Right? So if I give Adrian $10 and say split it between me and Erik, however you want, Erik, he gives you 9 and he gives me 1,
right?
And then Adrian says to you, Erik, give it all back to me so that I can distribute it correctly now. Why would I think he would do it correctly the second time? And we're using this as a first and second time example.
Sure.
This is not the government has not mismanaged money only once.
Lucy and the football in the Peanuts cartoon strip.
Exactly. Well, gentlemen, I think it's about time to wrap it up. We went in a lot of directions. We talked about spending, government philosophy, big government, small government. We talked about specific things in the tax plan. So we covered a lot today. hopefully we've made friends and people don't hate us and we keep all our listeners. Last time we had a political conversation, Adrian got a little trouble from some friend of his. So if that person's still listening,
all feedback's good.
Yeah. If that person is listening right now, please don't blame Adrian for what Erik and I said. But as I say every week, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you joining us every week. This has been another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show. Please like, subscribe, give us 5 stars. Check out the website, retirementlifestyleshow.com. And we'll be back next week to help you have a better life, retirement, lifestyle, financial, everything. See you next week.